Just not quite ready, and now we're ready. Go ahead.
Many claim to understand morality and to be moral, but Immanuel Kant presents a view of morality that defies common conceptions of the intricate subject. Some actions that the modern man considers to be good are unworthy of the qualifier moral in Kant's eyes. However, actions are not always qualified as moral or immoral based solely on the content of the action, but on the motive for that action. Kant argues that if actions, however good, are done for the sake of some reward or pleasure, those actions are not truly moral. In what is perhaps his most widely known argument, he presents certain criteria, called the categorical imperative, to be applied to actions to determine if they are moral. The basis of his argument rests with the understanding of the good will, which he defines at the beginning of his masterpiece, Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. The good will is in a sense the first mover of all other good things, as it is the sole influence of all moral actions, and thus an examination of the good will is necessary for understanding the remaining concepts concerning morality. His categorical imperative critiques how one's will drives his incentive to action, and it provides guidelines as to how one should treat others. All of this leads to a discussion about actions that seem good but that may not be truly moral. To aid in this discussion, it is also helpful to examine Aristotle's view on morality. Aristotle presents a view that is similar to Kant's, yet he is able to provide further insight into the matter by emphasizing the necessity of practicing morality in order to become moral. It is also helpful to draw a similarity between morality and Aristotle's depiction of a good friend. Firstly, however, one must find the good will. Kant explains that nothing can possibly be intrinsically good, that is, good without qualification, aside from a good will. Virtues that man considers to be good, such as strength, compassion, and intelligence, can all serve evil ends if directed by an evil will, and thus they are not intrinsically good. The good will is unconditionally good. To recognize the good will, one must first understand what the will is. Kant contends that everything in nature works according to laws. However, irrational beings of actions do not come immediately from laws. There must be an agent to connect laws with actions. And this agent of nothing less than practical reason is the will. While irrational beings must act in accordance with the laws that govern them, rational beings have the task of forming their actions in accordance with their understanding of the laws. It is in understanding the laws that man often stumbles. Now, this agent of practical reason, or the will, may be good or bad. In general, one understands a good will to be one that wills good actions, as opposed to evil actions. Kant, however, states that the good will is not good because of what it affects or accomplishes, or because of its competence to achieve some intended end. It is good only because of its willing. In essence, it is good in itself. Thus, one cannot consider the result of the will in determining if the will is good or not. Kant details this disconnect between the will and its actions. When viewed in this way, the will becomes not simply an agent of supreme foreknowledge, choosing an action from a supreme list of actions known to cause good results, but an instrument of practical reason, desiring only good in whatever shape that good comes. The good will has, in a sense, a layer of abstraction separating it from the results of actions motivated by the will. It cares only for the incentive and not for the result. This understanding of the good will becomes the foundation for the rest of Kant's arguments concerning morality. After establishing an appropriate conception of the good will, Kant explains his rigorous definition of what constitutes a moral action. He realizes that people tend to perform good deeds in order that they may benefit in some way, such as through rewards or public commendation. He argues that what one might consider a good deed is not necessarily a truly moral action. Kant sets forth three propositions of morality. Firstly, he asserts that an action is only truly moral if it was motivated by a certain sense of duty. This first proposition simply means that the morality of an action does not come from its intended result or purpose, but in the maxim, that is, the subjective principle of using one's will, that was enlisted to determine the action. In his second proposition, Kant proposes that an action done from duty does not have its moral worth in the purpose which is to be achieved through it, but in the maxim whereby it is determined. Therefore, the morality of an action is determined not by the end result, but in the reasoning for its willing. He sets forth standards for deciding the moral worth of actions, which he collectively refers to as the categorical imperative. Kant defines 3 criteria of the categorical imperative. The first, and the one commonly known as the formal categorical imperative, is, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Simply put, this formulation states that an action can only be considered moral if one can reasonably will everyone else to do it as well. For instance, this maxim rules out stealing, because if the right to steal were a universal rule, then everyone would steal from each other. No one could be trusted and society would collapse. On the other hand, working honestly to provide a living for one's family is both reasonable and necessary for a functional society, so it passes Kant's moral litmus test. Kant gives the example of one who takes joy in selflessly benefiting others by his actions. Although he acts not out of a vain or selfish motive and seeks only to help others, Kant declares that his actions are not moral. In his words, to be kind where one can is a duty, and there are, moreover, many persons so sympathetically constituted that without any motive of vanity or selfishness, they find an inner satisfaction in spreading joy and rejoice in the contentment of others which they have made possible. But I say that, however dutiful and however amiable it may be, that kind of action has no true moral worth. It is on a level with actions done from other inclinations, such as the inclination to honor, which, if fortunately directed to what in fact accords with duty and is generally useful and thus honorable, deserve praise and encouragement, but no esteem. Thus, although showing kindness to others is important, it is the attentiveness to one's duty, rather than a following of one's inclinations, that carries moral worth. While deeds such as caring for one's health and contributing to the advancement of society through honest labor are man's duty, Kant implies that such actions like these, that are otherwise in accordance with duty, can be tainted, in a sense, by the overreaching of man's inclinations. Acting out of duty to the moral law carries a strong sense of purpose and intention, inextricably bound to the action. When there is any loss of direct intention influencing the action, this connection is severed, and Kant would determine that the action is not moral. Kant finds that this duty must necessarily be present for any action to be considered moral. Thus, an action can be considered moral if one can reasonably will everyone else to perform it, and if the motive did not lead to the resulting action by accident. That is, it must be done willingly. This is the essence of the moral tests that make up the categorical imperative. After giving this first account of the categorical imperative, Kant presents 2 others. His second formulation takes into consideration the effects one's own actions have on others, rather than the impact that would result from one's actions becoming a universal maxim for all others to follow, as required in the first formulation. This formulation states that an action is moral if it leads one to treat others as ends, and not merely as the means to ends that he contrives for selfish purposes. His third formulation requires each individual to see the others as equal lawmakers in a theoretical kingdom of ends. Ideally, all rational beings would regard themselves as equally sovereign when creating laws, and similarly equally subject when obeying them. Taking these 3 formulations together is helpful when determining how one should fit his actions into the complex system of events that makes up the world. Having determined Kant's reasoning on morality, one can begin to examine whether or not otherwise good actions are still moral if there is an extrinsic incentive behind the action. Kant believes that a good action that is encouraged by some sort of reward is not actually moral. Again, Kant's definition of the moral law is the conception of which must determine the will without reference to the expected result. When one's actions, even if otherwise good, are influenced in anticipation of the result, Kantian logic would show that such actions are not truly moral, and extrinsic motivations for moral actions produce an obvious reference to the foreseeable outcome. If a person performs good works or noble deeds based on the knowledge that doing so will result in his being perceived as possessing superior morals, then his good works and noble deeds are primarily self-serving behaviors. Whether his desire is merely to feel or be seen as a so-called good person, or if such perception will lead to material gain, his actions do not spring from an altruistic spirit or pure love for his fellow man. The ulterior motive of a desire for fame, recognition, glory, or riches is a desire that flows from the sins of pride and covetousness. Kantian logic dictates that moral actions motivated by the expectation of an extrinsic reward are not technically moral. A woman who boasts about her volunteer work, selling tickets at a fundraising dinner for a non-profit organization of which she is a member, is performing this good work for the purpose of gaining the feeling of being a good person and of having her peers regard her as such. If asked why she does this volunteer work, she may say it is because she loves the planet and wants to help save it. While that may be true, the fact remains that she has an extrinsic motivation for her service. This extrinsic motivation does not render her action immoral. However, it can be described as non-moral, defined by Merriam-Webster as not falling into or existing in the sphere of morals or ethics. Non-moral essentially means that an action is neither moral nor immoral. While her action cannot be considered immoral, Kant would not consider her action to be moral. Thus, it has been established that performing good actions for an end other than that of an intrinsic good associated with a sense of duty is not truly an exhibition of moral behavior. The immediate arguments relate solely to the influence of positive motivation on one's behavior, but it is equally important to consider the merit of negative motivation. An example of negative motivation can be found in the influence of just laws on those with criminal tendencies. Would-be criminals may refrain from committing a crime solely to avoid the punishment for the crime. One could argue that such laws do not necessarily encourage people to be moral by Kant's standards, and instead seek self-preservation. But it is also important to consider the laws as instruments of protection for law-abiding citizens, rather than simply an attempt to improve the morality of some. When a law is set in place primarily to serve as protection of the property and well-being of individuals or states, improving the morality of criminals does not appear to be a significant focus. Whether or not laws should be involved in cultivating the morality of those it controls is a controversial issue. But it is important to remember that leges sine moribus vene, or laws without morals, are vain. While examining positive and negative motivations, it becomes apparent that both are conducted for the sake of encouraging good and deterring bad moral behavior by giving someone an extrinsic reason to change their behavior. If one should refrain from using extrinsic motivation by rewarding good behavior, should he also refrain from using extrinsic motivation by punishing bad behavior? If the goal of moral philosophy is for individuals to act morally simply for the sake of being moral, then any extrinsic motivation, positive or negative, is ultimately missing the point and is useless. For example, if a parent should not offer material rewards in response to his child's good actions, should he also not offer material punishment, a good whipping, for example, as a consequence for the child's bad actions? After all, if negative extrinsic motivation is just as useless as positive motivation, then neither should be tolerated. However, one must consider another example. In the case of punishing lawbreakers, it is understood that the reason for this is to protect the general innocent public. If society did not take such actions on lawbreakers, those who disregard morality, namely psychopaths, would run loose and terrorize the public. Thus, even though one's morality may be tainted by the existence of extrinsic motivations, such as the possibility of punishment, the general public should have some protection against those who do not wish to improve their morality in the first place. So it seems that there is a place for extrinsic motivation for good behavior. Although Kant does not go into detail about a case of this sort, this is a situation where one arguably has a duty to protect the general public from harm. Although Kant emphasizes in the categorical imperative that you have to have morality for morality's sake, perhaps there are appropriate applications for extrinsic incentives. A common temporary application for such incentives is found in the case of a parent initially providing extrinsic motivations to encourage moral behavior in their child, and slowly transitioning to an intrinsic motivation for morality. Although this may occur frequently, it is not always permanently effective. This transition process involves starting with seeming moral crutches, which are the extrinsic motivations for moral behavior, and the process continues with one slowly attempting to move off the crutches and walk morally unassisted. This is manifest in the situation of a mother attempting to convince her child to stop drawing on a whiteboard in their home with a permanent marker, and so she promises to buy him an alluring new toy if he simply be good. The child agrees, not understanding why his actions were wrong, but captivated by the prospect of receiving a new toy if he changed his actions to meet his mother's request. Aside from the issues that one would come to expect trying to get off of normal crutches, there is one key problem. The one on the moral crutches does not necessarily understand that he needs to get off the crutches. If he has always used the crutches and not known anything but the crutches, he will not understand why one would try to live without the crutches, and he may very well fight to keep them. Naturally, the reason that such motivations work temporarily is because they are at a level that the child is capable of understanding, while the real rewards of morality tend to be abstract and are not always apparent to anyone. However, after receiving recompense for his good obedience to his mother's commands, the child will continue to expect some sort of rewards to come as a result of his good actions. If for whatever reason he does not receive such recompense, he will be confused and he may reject the necessity of performing moral actions in the future. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle contends that moral virtue is like other virtues, such as bravery and temperance, and thus it is a virtue that one must practice in order to learn. By practicing the acts of morality, one will learn morality. In a similar way to Kant, Aristotle holds that moral actions must be done deliberately. He gives an example of one throwing goods off a ship in the midst of a storm, arguing that one obviously would not do this for the sake of itself, but for potentially saving the ship and everyone on board. At first, this course of reasoning appears to show Aristotle in disagreement with Kant. One would not throw goods off a ship if it did not bring about some good, such as saving the ship and its passengers, and thus this action seems to have some reference to the expected result. However, here Aristotle is not promoting an awareness of the result, but of the circumstances. Everything that is done by reason of ignorance is not voluntary. It is only what produces pain and repentance that is involuntary. When one is not pained by his ignorant actions, his actions would not be considered involuntary, yet they are not voluntary. As Aristotle writes, since he differs from the other, it is better that he should have a name of his own. An acceptance of Kant's and Aristotle's views of morality leads one to treat morality like the good friend treats his friends. Aristotle claims that the good friend cares only for the well-being of his friend. The perfect friendship is not one of mere utility or pleasure, but where each person looks out for the other's needs. The parallel is manifest in how the good friend should treat the other. He should treat his friend as an end in himself, just as Kant believes one should treat morality. Aristotle gives examples of men who pursue friendship solely to gain something that really does not involve seeking the well-being of the other. Now those who love each other for their utility do not love each other for themselves, but in virtue of some good which they get from each other. A similar concept applies to the pursuit of morality. Every person should not seek morality so that he may gain something worldly. That is, he should not consider it as a means to an end, but rather as the end. Aristotle declares that because what one considers useful is not static, when the motive of the friendship is done away, the friendship is dissolved, inasmuch as it existed only for the ends in question. So with morality, when the incentive is removed, one who relied on that incentive before will no longer be interested, which again shows the importance of one's actions being done for the sake of morality alone, rather than for some flimsy material objective. Of course, all the specifics of how one should be moral are meaningless if there is no reason to strive to be moral in the first place. Even if one understands that his actions affect himself and others, for better or for worse, what is the point? One could say that moral actions should be done to the benefit of others, perhaps even to improve the morality of others. Kant's logic focuses on improving one's own morality and does not present any arguments concerning the moral impact of one's actions on others. Socrates, however, holds strongly that no outside forces can change oneself. Man can only affect his own soul. Crito came to visit Socrates while the latter was in jail, and as the two were discussing the merit of the opinion of the many, Socrates states that they can do neither good nor evil. They cannot make a man wise or make him foolish. Socrates' thinking mirrors what Jesus declares in the Gospel of Mark. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. If one's actions do not affect others, then what exactly comes of his actions? Socrates believes you should be moral to improve your soul, yet Kant does not speak of rewards such as the betterment of the soul, and seems to hold that you should be moral for the sake of morality itself. In Socrates' words, justice in her own nature has been shown to be best for the soul in her own nature. There will be no harm in further enumerating how many and how great are the rewards which justice and the other virtues procure to the soul from gods and men, both in life and after death. Now, a distinction between these two mindsets is clear. Is morality the end, as Kant seemed to believe, or is it simply a means of bettering the soul, as it is shown in Socrates' dialogue with Crito and in the Bible? Perhaps the answer is not exclusively one or the other, but there is truth in both. One can use Kant's categorical imperative, along with the Bible, to improve their morality, without letting morality itself become an idol. A conception of morality has been implanted in each human, whether he acknowledges it or not. He should strive to be moral, but ultimately this should be primarily a contributing factor in his development, and at his steading ever to excel. In conclusion, in his Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant presents an understanding of morality that has noticeable differences from the common perceptions of the subject. His views differ from the ideas of morality presented by Socrates and by the Savior, but they are similar to Aristotle's ideals concerning the good friend. Actions that one might consider to be moral may yet fail Kant's rigorous specifications. What sets Kant's thoughts apart from others is his focus, as it rests less on the content of an action and more on the motive for that action. For an action to be truly moral, he requires said action to be done solely for the sake of its morality, without any reference to the expected result. He calls these unconditional criteria that he develops the categorical imperative. Rather than given actions having some reference to the expected result, he requires that they have a connection with the good will and a sense of duty to the moral law. Aristotle's Discourse on Ethics agrees with this view, adding that one must be fully aware of his actions and be in full understanding of his circumstances for one's actions to be moral. While Kant's reasoning is beneficial in determining the moral worth of actions, he may not focus enough on the Christian goal, the development of man's soul in order to please God.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dugmore. If you give me a moment, I'll have some opening questions for you. Could you begin by explaining again what I thought was a very interesting point, your comparison between Kant's categorical imperative and Aristotle's understanding of the perfect friendship?
Yes. So, Kant believes that we should be moral simply for morality's sake, and Aristotle believes that we should treat our friend well simply for his own sake, simply for the sake of benefiting our friend. So the similarity is in how pure the action is and how focused the action is intrinsically on, in Aristotle's case, on the friend, and in Kant's case, on morality.
Okay. And Aristotle says that the perfect friendship is something that we really don't have, but fairly rarely. That most of our interactions with people are utilitarian relationships, and he seems to say you only have 2 or 3 friends in your life, and it seems to be a very special relationship. Now, Kant, though, implying that all action should be without motivation, seems to be saying that all of my human interactions need to be of this perfect nature. That he mentioned in his paper, he says that we should be treating people as ends and not means. But many of my interactions with people are for a particular end that I need them to help me go about. That it seems like Kant is saying that almost all of my human interactions are tainted somehow. I'm trying to imagine my interaction with the grocery store clerk, going and trying to go to the grocery store clerk and say, I'm coming here and I want to make this interchange with you, but I just want you to know I'm not using you right now, and you are not a means for me. I'm trying to, get through the checkout line and treat you as an end rather than a means. Well, it seems to be almost ridiculous, or what that would do to almost all of our human interaction would be fairly ridiculous. And so, is that understanding of Kant wrong? Is there some is there some leeway that he gives for, having people as ends in our life and that being just fine? Or do you think Kant would basically require of us to treat every human interaction as somehow an ends rather than a means to something else?
Well, although Kant doesn't mention it himself, I don't think. I do want to bring up the word non-moral that I gave in the paper. I think that would apply to a lot of actions, to maybe the majority of actions. In the cases where, like in the grocery example, where maybe you're not doing it directly for his good, but you're not doing it particularly at his expense in an unfair way. So, Kant is very strict, and I would say that he would believe that those truly aren't moral, but he doesn't say that other actions are bad or immoral.
Mm-hmm. Looking at another perspective of looking at the exchange with the merchant is to say, well, we had a equitable exchange of money and goods, and therefore it's moral. He didn't cheat me, I didn't cheat him. We did the moral thing in that interaction. Kant seems to be saying that when you're interacting with other people, that doesn't seem to be good enough. You need to have people as ends. And is there anything wrong with just saying that our interactions with people can be selfish and yet at the same time moral? We had this exchange, we come into the deal, we make our exchange, it's fundamentally a selfish exchange, but I gave you what you expected, you gave me what I expected, and therefore it's a moral exchange, even though, yes, we're using each other.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say that I'm not really sure what he would think of that kind of action, because there is still some expected result from that action of me benefiting and the other person benefiting. So I think he would call that a good action. Whether it's particularly moral, I don't think he would call it a moral action.
Mm-hmm. And at the end of your paper, you said, just at the beginning of your conclusion, you write, in conclusion, in its foundations of the metaphysics of morals, Immanuel Kant presents an understanding of morality that has noticeable differences from the common perceptions of the subject. His views differ from the ideas of morality presented by Socrates and by the Savior, but they are similar to Aristotle's ideals concerning the good friend. Could you explain again how you understand Kant's view of what is moral to be at odds with what is presented by Christ?
As Christians, we believe that our actions are done solely to please God, and but Kant has this very single-minded focus on just doing it because it's moral, doing it for the sake of morality, but as if morality is God. And we could say, but God is morality, God is goodness, God is justice. So, in a sense, is it the same thing? But I don't think it is. I think Kant doesn't really seem to have. He never really mentions Christ in his works, and in this section at least, he doesn't talk about God. Morality seems to be this ideal that's separate and maybe obtainable for humans, but God doesn't really come into the picture. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where the difference is.
So would you say that for the Christian, morality is more oriented around the principle of pleasing God, whereas for Kant, the moral code stands as a sort of more impersonal, objective morality that must be followed without a sort of more personal connection to a divinity?
Yeah, I don't think he presents morality as being a personal, an entity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Dugmore. Other questions?